In my last video, I shared with you guys about why some authors argue that there should be a broadening of the agenda of security studies, and today we'll talk about securitization theory. So first, I want to give a quick summary about this video. Securitization theory seeks to recognize that the patterns of configuration of the security dilemma, the problems that generate instability and stability in the contemporary world, have changed, and it is necessary to know how to deal with this change. It aims to be both a theory that takes care of the problem of enlargement as well as being scientific. It has a science proposal a little different from the more classical positivist approaches to international relations. In this video, we'll cover how securitization theory begins. This is related to the problem of migration that Europe went through, which was an inevitable problem to think about the stability of the European political system. Also, we'll look at the theory concepts and how it views the security problem. The key thing about these authors is that they propose a different interpretation of security problems, which are centered on the nature of language. Finally, we'll analyze how this alters our understanding of the dynamics of different social spaces. Before, there was a classic contractualist division about how the social world works. There was this division between the private and public world. The private is linked to the personal, the community, and the subject. The public is linked to the norms that govern the behavior of different people who need to coexist within the same space and are within a political regulation. The reflection leads to the proposition that there is a third sphere. There's a form of interaction between certain people or between certain actors called the security dimension. This is when, due to a set of circumstances, a given issue takes on such a flagrant emergency character that the rules that politically regulated the relationship between the actors no longer work to deal with that threat that is configured at that moment. So it is necessary to resort to exceptional measures in order to manage the problem generated by that particular issue, be it the climate issue or the issue of the new coronavirus pandemic. There are these three ideas and also the realization that they are not fixed. In a way, we have circumstances where processes that are in the private sphere can be brought to other spheres. As an example, we can highlight religion, which belongs to the private sphere, but in certain circumstances it can become a political problem when there is persecution of certain groups and the state needs to create regulations to manage this problem. There are exceptional circumstances in which the issue of religion becomes a security issue. With 9/11, Islam was transformed into a symbol of the war on terror. The Islamic religion itself became a symbol of the enemy that needed to be exterminated. In the end, we will talk about how this understanding was successful in talking about different spheres: health, energy, the military sector, the climate issue, all of this within the reflection on security, without losing the ability to have a theory that is somehow scientific. Also, we'll see to what extent this establishes a relationship between theories that have been seen so far. This problem arises in the reflection of a European school known as the Copenhagen School, because it was a research center based in Copenhagen that developed the first reflections on the problem of securitization. This is linked to the set of transformations that made the migration problem a relevant issue for European society. In Europe, we have a moment of the Cold War in which Europe is completely immersed in the security configuration launched by the American hegemony within a Cold War scenario. There is European growth due to American investments. There is a massive entry of migrant labor. All of this works well, although some groups are starting to position themselves as resistant. Cold War developments lead to a migration process that is highly stimulated throughout the 60s. While Europe is growing, its manpower is scarce. But there has been great resistance in certain sectors of the population since the 70s. Europe enters into crisis. When there is crisis and unemployment, the perception of migrants changes, in which there is cultural confrontation and colonial resentment. All of these factors heighten the resentment between the communities that have been in Europe for generations and the migrant community that is entering at that moment. This division is fundamental for the reflection of these authors. There is a degree of hostility generated against those communities. From the moment this whole situation is produced in the European scenario, it already transcends from the point of view of the merely political proposal. These problems cannot be solved by classical security theories, because it is a scenario where there is a threat of a non-military nature. The number of migrants in Europe creates anxiety. Furthermore, cultural differences are a factor of estrangement, which leads to tension and hostility. None of this has a military materiality behind it. What is being threatened is not exactly the state. It is a perception of a somewhat abstract cultural unity. It's a narrative about who you are that is being threatened by a different community. What is being threatened is not necessarily the geographic boundary of the state. It is the cultural integrity of a perception about the state, about how the state should be, about the legitimate ways of being, of acting in that state. These are two difficult problems to solve. The fact that it is not a threat of a military nature, and the fact that you have an object that is clearly not material. It is not the geographic boundaries of the state that are being threatened by that transformation. The securitization theory seeks to show that traditional theories did not explain the transformations they witnessed in the 80s on the European scenario. So what traditional theories could not explain? For these securitization theory authors, there are two things traditional theories fail to explain. First, non-military processes are important and influence people's perceptions of security. Second, what is being threatened by this transformation is not the structural, material, objective frontier apparatus of the state. It's not the territory and its integrity. The person who feels threatened by the entry of an immigrant does not assume that they will invade Congress and seize power. That is not the fear. The fear is that the presence of these immigrants becomes so determinant in the way society works that after a certain moment they no longer recognize their society. These 2 points are important from the point of view that it is from these contradictions that we will understand how to adjust the concepts to expand your ability to understand reality. The first thing the theory proposes is to carry out an intellectual epistemological reflection from a theoretical point of view in which it is necessary to go beyond traditional theories. One of the important limitations of conventional international relations theories is that they have a limited understanding of how language works. It is precisely because they do not understand the role of language well that they do not understand how language creates various problems that mark social reality, including the problem of security. These authors resort to a distinction within the philosophy of language between the descriptive function and the performative function of language. Positivist theories are anchored in the idea that the only function that language fulfills is the descriptive function. Language recognizes the elements that constitute reality, but language does more than describe. By recognizing certain elements about reality, it constitutes that reality itself. It intervenes and interferes with reality by describing it in a certain way. Language does more than allow you to identify which elements are present in the environment. It tells you what role is played when you enter that environment. If the Minister of Economy declares that a state will not intervene in the economy, this assertion can be seen from 2 angles. We can observe the elements that constitute this statement itself, what that statement says. We can also observe what happens from the moment he makes his statement. For the moment someone with the status of the Minister of Economy comes to the public and says that the state will not intervene in the economy, several important economic actors recognize this speech and will try to adjust their expectations in light of what the minister said. His statement modifies the very dynamics of the economy in which he exists. It's important to understand materiality and performative character. What happens because you say something specific? The descriptive function of language presents the elements that constitute reality. The performative function of language intervenes in the reality in which you exist. This is important because for these authors, we don't understand the plurality of security without understanding this difference. For realists, security has always been linked to the materiality of how many weapons you have, how many victims a given scenario presents. For securitization authors, it is necessary to go beyond materiality. To understand what produces security or insecurity, it is necessary to understand the effect this has on the perception of a given actor. If we compare a missile produced by France and one produced by North Korea, the materiality is potentially identical. The engineering involved does not fundamentally change, but the US is far more insecure about the North Korean-produced nuclear missile than the French nuclear program. To understand the security and diversity of security standards that we observe in the contemporary scenario, this dimension about security is needed. You have to understand that security is not a thing. Security is a process. It is a process through which certain patterns and processes need to gain an emergency denotation that did not exist before. When there was migration to Europe in the 60s, it was already being openly encouraged. This was not a problem and not a matter of existential threat. Society did not feel openly threatened, but something has changed. A certain set of circumstances allows certain actors to securitize the migration issue and other issues. Migration is turned into a security issue. The first central concept in the proposal of this approach is to understand what constitutes a securitizing act. It is a political articulation that aims to bring a certain issue and turn it into a security problem. It is the speech act, which, in view of its performative function, seeks to characterize a certain object as a security object. Within the most classic version of this theory, we have three fundamental elements for constituting a problem as a security problem. First, it is necessary to have the idea of an existential threat. Second, this existential threat must demand emergency measures from society. The norms that politically regulated that issue are no longer sufficient to manage that problem. For example, the US after 9/11. As a result of this, there was a set of regulations passed in the US that authorized the arbitrary curtailment of the rights of a portion of American society. For example, the Patriot Act was approved, in which people who should have equal status in matters of law and should not be imprisoned without justification, they start to be restricted from this right because of an emergency measure. There is a belief that the attack was a threat to the existence of American society. This allows you to create exception mechanisms. These are mechanisms that allow the rules that apply to everyone in the US at any given time to no longer apply to certain groups. Once the Patriot Act was passed, anyone could be arrested without any preliminary charges. They could be detained for 30 days without being charged with anything. The rights they had prior to the Patriot Act they no longer had because of the steps that were taken to deal with an exceptional threat. And third, these exceptional measures transcend the sphere of conventional political dynamics. That object cannot be threatened with current policies. New rules are needed to manage that problem. Just as we need the Securitizing Act to turn a particular issue into a security problem, we also need an actor. There is always an actor behind the act. In the view of these authors, what conventional theories have failed to understand is that they have always looked at security looking at the same sector, the military sector. They have always made an immediate association between the military sector as the only source of insecurity and the only sector to generate answers to the security problems you experience. However, according to the securitization authors, there are several sectors. For example, we can point out the pandemic scenario. It reorganized the way we live, and every dispute within the space of reflection of the pandemic is a reflection on the problem of securitization. This can be understood because we have political actors trying to securitize the pandemic problem and political actors trying to desecuritize. We have political actors trying to convince the population to treat the pandemic as a security problem where there is a threat to society's existence and extraordinary measures need to be taken. Treating the pandemic in a certain way is a political debate that is always treated as something that goes beyond politics. Its political interest from the point of view of those who wish to securitize the pandemic should not interfere with what measures society needs to take to survive the pandemic. From this, we have a debate between the technician and the politician that will translate into this dilemma about science, vaccines, government, etc. We have an agent who seeks to show that the pandemic is a threat and that is why we need to securitize it. Implementing exceptional measures and the reality of this diagnosis is supported by the fact that the threat of the pandemic goes beyond our political differences. The discourse surrounding the pandemic is characterized by these three phases. There is a counter-discourse that seeks to desecuritize the problem of the pandemic, trying trying to securitize the problem of the economy, the economic consequences of the securitization of the pandemic are seen as a more determinate threat than the pandemic. In a way, we have a counter-securitization. Faced with this conceptual change, it is necessary to highlight the concepts that will allow us to interpret the security scenarios. It is necessary to understand what a securitizing act is because security is a process. If it's a process, it's built. If it is constructed, it is not spontaneous. It is an act, and some conditions must be created. It is necessary to have an actor behind this act. Actors build security discourses by trying to securitize specific sectors. Since all securitization is an act, it doesn't always work. Not every narrative that is constructed to securitize a particular phenomenon works. These concepts help to structure a reflection of security that will look at it not as something fixed, a materiality, a result of the correlation of forces. Security for these authors is a process. Therefore, as it is a social construction, it is necessary to identify all these elements in order to understand the dynamics within which security works. It is necessary to understand the acts, the actors, the audience that is the target of this securitization, and to what extent it is effective or not. With this concept, we can understand the different interaction patterns through which security processes are consolidated or destructured, from which certain measures will become appropriate or not to deal with certain phenomena. To understand how security works, it is less useful to work with the idea of a global distribution of forces and more useful to understand in each region of the globe how we can observe different patterns of interaction. Understanding these patterns helps you see how certain threats are more prominent in some places than others, and how certain measures to manage those threats are more legitimate in some places than others. For example, South America. In security discourses built around South American countries, we observe drug trafficking, or some determinant variable. This has to do with the dynamics of the region. In some other countries, drug trafficking is not treated as a security issue. Thus, it is the region that determines the standards that allow the characterization of certain processes as threats and certain ways of dealing with these processes as legitimate. The militarization of drug trafficking is something that became very common in Latin America in the 90s. This is a specific and exceptional process in Latin America. In Africa, we have organizations that manage to build a case that extreme poverty generates a condition of social disruption that is an emergency problem. It is a threat not only to the individual who may die of malnutrition, but to the entire community as a whole. So we have a variable that, for example, is not a security issue in the US, but it is a variable that generates a decisive resource mobilization capacity to deal with the problems in Africa. Likewise, terrorism is a way of securitizing certain processes that has become very crucial for the construction of the US security discourse, but it is not as decisive for the regional security complex in Brazil and Latin America. We have the concepts that characterize the securitization strategy both from the point of view of the securitizing act as well as the securitizing actor, the audience that is the target of that securitization, the effectiveness of the act, and the sector that is being mobilized. We also have the dynamics, the space of relationships within which securitization patterns emerge, called regional security complexes. This helps to understand the specificity of securitization processes in certain areas of the world. Geography is important but not decisive. The determinant is the interactive process. It is the dynamics of the relationship between the actors and not their territoriality. Finally, we have the dimension that we understand that security is a process. The object becomes fluid and some things become characterized as security, while others are no longer characterized as such. Security is a space for political and social struggle, as political as the political space itself. So we have the understanding that security is more a specific dimension of how the political struggle between certain actors manifests itself. We have a social world with the idea that there is a dimension of the private world, where disputes, norms, values, and decisions are interpersonal and communal. The fact of sharing a common knowledge and identity are indispensable conditions for this dynamic of the private. We have the public world of the law. It is what regulates the behavior of actors who do not know each other, but who need to interact regularly. We also need to continue this interaction over time. We have norms which help to coexist within a social space, with different people. They do not need to have the same religion or the same political party, but they are subject to the same rule of law, at least in theory. And we have the security space. It is the space in which struggles are determined by the effectiveness of emergency speeches and exceptional measures justified by this emergency speech. What they try to show is that to understand not only the specificity of these domains, there is also a circulation between these three things. Things that are private can become political issues, things that are political can become security issues. And the opposite is also true. For example, religion can be brought from a dimension of political conflict to the private sphere. Finally, they build this reflection on expansion, building the theoretical apparatus in a way that allows them to raise clear hypotheses about security problems and also to test them properly. The authors feel that if we build knowledge about securitization correctly enough, we somehow don't need to break with the knowledge accumulation process. This is important because all international relations theories up to that point are a more specific version of a broader process. It is as if the securitization theory was given a more general theory, in that the realist liberal theories of international relations were just a specific case of the securitization of a particular sector. So for them, securitization is a theory capable of accumulating everything if brought before, because that's all just a particular case of a broader theory. This securitization theory claims to be able to embrace previous theories, and therefore it is part of the scientific process. It is not necessary to abandon the theories of previous generations. They were just looking at the military sector and its particularities. If we recognize the fact that security is a process and it can reach many sectors, and all these sectors, both in the military and in the other sectors, securitization is a securitizing act that needs to be constructed and politically justified and be effective in its process of political justification. Also, we have seen in this video the importance of language. Language has two functions, descriptive and performative. Descriptive language can be understood as the elements that constitute the reality before us. It allows to observe the materiality within which the security debates will take place. With performative language, we understand that when making a speech, we have an impact on the dynamics of the reality we seek to recognize. So not only do we look at reality, we also build it by looking from a certain perspective. Also, security is a process. The understanding of security as something fixed analyzes power correlations. This can be understood as a relative assessment of the material capacity of the different forces present in the system, in which we observe how to transform certain material conditions into an element of security. In securitization theory, to understand security, it is necessary to understand that it is a process. From this, we can think about the functions of language, because reality is not fixed, and an issue can be transformed into a security problem. For that, it is necessary to have a securitizing act, which has three elements: an existential threat, exceptional measures, and a scenario that goes beyond what conventional policies can handle. By accepting that security is a process, it is necessary to bring a set of concepts that help in the strategies that mobilize this. It is necessary to have an actor behind the act, a specific audience, someone to convince in order to legitimize the exceptional measures they seek to undertake. This process can be successful or not successful, and can involve different sectors of society: military sector, environmental sector, health sector. By accepting security as a result of these patterns, the interaction processes of different actors with different agendas, as they interact more intensely, this creates particular patterns of interaction that determine the security dilemmas of certain regions in a very specific way. To study security in Latin America, it is necessary to understand the specific discourses of the region. As an example, we can highlight what is drug trafficking, militarization of drug trafficking according to the singularities of the studied region. This is the regional security complex. The conceptual change this brings is that we come to understand security as something that is not defined a priori. It is more of a social process with a particular working dynamic. Just as the political world and the private world have their working dynamics, so do security processes. Also, objects can move between these three spheres. For example, religion, which can be observed in these three areas. Securitization authors have become influential because they intend to manage the plurality of the agenda with the rigor of the way scientific knowledge is made. Through this idea, by properly understanding the securitization theory, it is possible to observe that the scientific theories that come earlier are specific cases of a broader approach. That's all. If you like this video, then don't forget to give it a thumbs up. Also, next week's video is about critical theory. If you don't want to miss it, then hit the notification bell. Until next time, thanks for watching.